Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a story that honestly sounds almost made up, but it reshaped global banking as we know it. Picture this: a massive, multi-billion-dollar international money laundering scheme. $7 billion. And the nerve center, not some high-tech bunker, but what our sources call a small single-room office in Queens, New York.
Yeah, it's quite the contrast. And that small office running what became known as the Benex Scandal, it really is the flashpoint. It's arguably the main reason we have the kind of banking, security, and compliance rules you deal with every day.
Right, so our sources lay out this incredible failure, basically, of the systems of the Bank of New York Bowman Y, $7 billion flowing out illegally. So the mission for us today is to unpack how that system broke down so badly, and crucially, how it forced this huge overhaul in global finance.
Exactly. And you can't understand Benex without understanding the context. This wasn't just, a simple crime. It was driven by this enormous capital flight right after the Soviet Union collapsed. So we actually need to start there, in the total economic chaos of post-Soviet Russia. Some critics even called it piratization.
Piratization, I like that. And the scale of that collapse was just immense, right? Between 91 and 97, the Russian economy basically shrank by almost half.
Yeah, nearly 50%. And it wasn't just numbers on a page. We're talking hyperinflation, mass unemployment, people's lives getting drastically worse, even life expectancy dropping sharply.
So amidst that chaos, this new class emerges, the oligarchs. They get control of these massive state assets.
Right, through privatization. But here's the kicker. Property rights were, basically meaningless. The legal system was incredibly weak. So if you're one of these new oligarchs sitting on billions in assets, why would you keep it in Russia where it could be seized tomorrow?
Okay, that makes a frightening kind of sense. The smart move, maybe the only rational move from their perspective, was to, as the sources say, tunnel value out of their company. Get the money out fast before someone else grabbed it.
Precisely. It was asset stripping on a national scale. And that created this huge, desperate demand for a way out, a secure, hidden pipeline to get plundered money offshore. And that's exactly what the Benex operation was built for.
So it was custom built for this market.
Absolutely. Helping Russian companies, oligarchs, maybe even criminal groups, dodge taxes, skip customs, and crucially, wash money from, outright criminal enterprises. The chaos in Russia created the perfect storm, the perfect market for this kind of service.
Okay, so the demand was definitely there. Let's follow the money trail then. The really shocking part is that the Bank of New York, BONY, this huge established institution, apparently had no idea $7 billion was washing through its accounts.
Well, no idea might be generous. It was a catastrophic failure of their own systems, their internal audit, their compliance departments. Completely missed it.
So who did catch it?
That's what's so incredible. It wasn't BONY. The alerts came from outside. Totally external triggers.
Okay, lay them out for us.
Trigger number 1, foreign police work. It actually started with Britain's National Crime Squad, the NCS, back in 1998. They weren't even looking at BONY initially.
What were they investigating?
They were deep into investigating Semion Mogilevich, a really notorious figure in Russian organized crime. And during that investigation, they found financial links.
Links to what?
Links between a company known to be a front for Mogilevich YBM Magnex and this completely unknown entity called Benex International. That set off alarm bells internationally.
Wow. Okay, so the Brits stumbled onto it. What was the second trigger?
This one is almost ironic. It came from a competitor bank right there in New York.
A competitor? Seriously?
Yeah. Republic National Bank of New York filed something called a suspicious activity report in SAR. They noticed these enormous sums flowing through these obscure Benex accounts at BONY and alerted U.S. law enforcement.
So let me get this straight. British police looking into the Russian mob and a rival bank doing basic diligence. They spot the $7 billion elephant in the room. But BONY's own internal compliance, costing millions, saw nothing.
That's the damning truth. And when the scandal finally broke, BONY's first instinct, naturally, was damage control. They tried to frame it as just, a couple of rogue employees acting alone.
Let's talk about those alleged rogue employees, because the setup sounds pretty sophisticated.
It really does undermine the rogue narrative. The key players were a married couple. Lucy Edwards, she was vice president at BONY, actually based in their London office, and she specialized in Eastern European business.
Okay, so she's inside the bank.
Right. And her husband was Peter Berlin, a Russian emigre. He was the one physically running the shell companies.
And these were the companies funneling the money.
Benex International Inc., and another one, BECS International LLC. And yes, he operated them out of that now infamous small single-room office in Queens.
It still sounds like something from a movie. A tiny office in Queens handling billions.
It does, but here's where the institutional failure really bites. Edwards, using her VP position inside BNY, did something crucial. She managed to get these shell companies classified internally not as regular high-risk corporate accounts, but as private banking clients.
And what did that designation do?
It meant much, much less scrutiny. Private banking clients often get, well, a lighter touch on compliance checks compared to, say, a new corporate entity moving vast sums.
Okay, that's a huge loophole. But how do they actually move the money so fast and so often?
Oh, this is the technical key, the really devastating part. Edwards didn't just reclassify them. She actually gave Peter Berlin's Queens office BNY's own proprietary electronic banking software. It was called Micro CA Register.
The bank's own software, what could it do?
It was powerful stuff designed for major corporate clients. And the critical feature, it let account holders, like Berlin Shells, make international wire transfers directly, often hundreds per day, crucially, without paperwork needing to go through normal bank channels for each transfer.
Wait, so this tiny office in Queens could just log into BNY's system and fire off hundreds of wires a day, getting instructions straight from a bank in Moscow, DKB Bank, with no paper trail inside BNY for each transaction.
You got it. They essentially handed over the keys to the vault. BNY didn't just fail to catch the laundering. They actively, if perhaps unknowingly at first, equipped Berlin's office to function as its own unlicensed, unregulated New York branch of this Moscow bank, DKB. The system was effectively bypassed.
But someone must have noticed the sheer volume, the fees. How could management not ask questions?
Well, that's where motive comes in. Why the willful blindness? Sources are pretty clear. The Benex and BECS accounts were incredibly profitable. They became the highest fee-producing accounts in the One Wall Street branch.
Money talks.
It shouts, in this case. When accounts are generating that kind of revenue, there's immense internal pressure to, let's say, overlook red flags. Basic know your customer. Cable D principles just went out the window. They weren't just passively blind. The incentives actively discouraged looking too closely.
Okay, let's shift back to the source of the money in Russia. You mentioned DKB Bank in Moscow, feeding the funds into Benex. Who was behind DKB?
Right, DKB was the feeder, but it wasn't acting alone. It was controlled by other very powerful Russian institutions. Think MDM Bank, Sabin Bank. And the chairman of MDM Bank at the time, Alexander Mamut, was widely identified as being part of President Boris Yeltsin's inner circle.
So a direct line from this money laundering pipe straight to the top of the Russian state.
An undeniable link. It immediately connected the Benex pipeline not just to business, but to the political elite running Russia at the time.
And then there's a darker layer underneath that.
Yes, the organized crime connection. The FBI explicitly linked Benex to Semion Mogilevich, the so-called boss of all bosses, of the giant Slonskaya Bratva, the Savo crime syndicate.
How strong was that link?
Pretty direct. Testimony later on that something like 90% of the money flowing through Benex actually belonged to the Russian Mafia.
Wow.
So what Benex really exposes is this complete fusion during the 90s in Russia. You couldn't clearly separate the oligarchs, the Yeltsin administration officials, and major organized crime figures. They were all intertwined, and they were all using the same offshore pipeline, Benex, to get their money out.
And that leads us to perhaps the most politically explosive part of this whole scandal, the connection to international aid.
This is where it gets truly damning. Remember the economic chaos in Russia? The country was on the verge of total collapse. So in July 1998, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, steps in with a huge bailout loan tranche, $4.8 billion.
Intended to stabilize the Russian economy, prop up the ruble, help the country.
Exactly. That was the intent. But what happened just days after Russia received that $4.8 billion in hard currency?
They defaulted on their debt, didn't they?
They did. Russia defaulted, chaos ensued, and now look at the Benex pipeline immediately after that default. Between October 1998 and March 1999, just a few months, what happens?
Let me guess, a surge of money.
A massive surge. $4.2 billion flowed through the Benex accounts in that short period.
Almost the exact amount of the IMF loan tranche.
Precisely. The implication is unavoidable. That IMF money, dollars meant to save the Russian economy, was effectively captured by the elite. They likely swapped their rapidly collapsing rubles for those IMF dollars and then immediately funneled the hard currency offshore using the Benex system.
So the rescue package became a private exit strategy.
That's what it looks like, a staggering betrayal. That money was meant for the Russian people who were suffering enormously. Instead, it seems it lubricated the escape route for the very people potentially involved in creating the crisis. It directly contributed to that shocking decline in living standards our sources mentioned.
Just incredible cynicism. Okay, so $7 billion laundered, international aid potentially siphoned off. What happened to the people involved? What was the punishment?
Well, this is where the story takes another turn. The main operators, Lucy Edwards and Peter Berlin, they cooperated with prosecutors. Their sentences were, well, remarkably light. 6 months of house arrest, 5 years probation. And they had to pay about $685,000 in restitution.
6 months house arrest for facilitating $7 billion in money laundering. That seems disproportionate.
It certainly raised eyebrows. And what about the bank, BNY itself? After years of investigation, BNY Mellon, as it became known, settled with the U.S. authorities in 2005.
For how much?
The total settlement was $38 million. That covered violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, the BSA, and included an admission of systemic failures.
$38 million. On $7 billion laundered, that's what, about 0.5%?
Less than 1%, yeah. It's a fraction. And interestingly, even getting to $38 million involved some serious international legal pressure. In 2007, the Russian Federal Customs Service did something pretty unprecedented.
What was that?
They filed a massive civil lawsuit against BNY in a Moscow court using U.S. RICO laws, the Anti-Racketeering Act. They sued for $22.5 billion in damages.
$22 billion, that sounds like financial warfare.
It was definitely geopolitical lawfare. Now, BNY fought it hard, and eventually that massive suit was settled for what reports called a nuisance figure of just $14 million. But the pressure was clearly felt. Still, the overall message seemed to be, massive institutional failure carries a relatively small price tag for the institution itself.
Okay, so light fines, late sentences. But you said earlier this changed everything. What was the real legacy?
The real legacy wasn't in the punishments, it was in the reaction. The Benex Scandal hammered home a crucial lesson. You simply couldn't trust the old ways of correspondent banking. The assumption that a foreign bank opening an account with you was inherently trustworthy was shattered. Benex proved that some foreign banks carried enormous money laundering risks.
And that realization forced a change in the law.
A fundamental change. The scandal directly led Congress to act. The key legislative response is often called the Benex Bill, informally. Officially, it's Title III of the USA Patriot Act, passed in the wake of 9/11, but with its roots firmly in the BNY failures.
The Patriot Act. How did Benex influence that?
Title III specifically targets the exact weaknesses Benex exploited. First, it completely overhauled the rules around correspondent banking facilities that core relationship BNY had with DKB. Much stricter oversight was mandated.
Okay, what else?
Second, it introduced mandatory due diligence and, importantly, enhanced due diligence for foreign correspondent accounts, especially those deemed high risk. Banks now had to investigate who they were dealing with much more thoroughly.
And the third big piece.
Perhaps the most visible change for everyone listening, Title III created the modern, mandatory Know Your Customer (KYC) framework. Those questions banks ask you, the ID checks, the source of funds inquiries, much of that stems directly from BNY's failure to simply ask Peter Berlin, what exactly are you doing with billions of dollars in this tiny Queen's office? It was a direct legislative fix for that specific failure.
So the irony is stark. Negligence leads to a tiny fine for the bank, relatively speaking, but it spawns this massive multi-trillion-dollar global compliance industry that affects every single international financial transaction today.
Exactly. The paradigm shifted completely. We went from a system based largely on assumed trust between banks to one based on mandated, rigorous, often bureaucratic verification.
So recapping, $7 billion escapes Russia via desktop PC in Queens, fueled by BNY's hunger for fees. The bank gets a slap on the wrist, but global finance is permanently and expensively altered.
And the final thought maybe for you listening is this. Benex was fundamentally about institutional blindness, a failure of basic diligence in a system assumed to be robust. Today's financial world is infinitely faster, more complex, more digital. We have KYC, we have AML rules, yes. But think about it. What other assumptions are we making now? What new vulnerabilities, maybe around crypto or instant payments or AI in finance, could be exploited by a similar, well-placed blind spot despite all the regulations we've built since Benex?
A sobering thought. The cost of that piratization in the 90s is still being paid in many ways through the structure of global finance today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.